Welcome to Listen Up NC. We're here to bring you the tools, resources, and information you need to know to be informed on issues impacting you, your family, and community. I'm your host, Derek Boston, and I am the director of Durham Headstart and Early Headstart in Durham, North Carolina. Radio family, Headstart programs play a vital role in the state of North Carolina as well as across the country. Headstart is the federally funded, comprehensive early education program designed to meet the emotional, social, health, nutritional, and psychological needs of children ages 3 to 5 and their families. The Early Headstart program is the companion program created to address the same needs of children from birth to age 3, expectant mothers and their families. It is our pleasure to have with us this morning Ms. Melissa Harrell, Mental Health Coordinator for Wayne Action Group for Economic Solvency, Inc. Wages. Located in Goldsboro, North Carolina, Ms. Harrell serves the families of Wages in Headstart in Wayne County to increase resiliency and mental wellness in her organization and the communities they represent, which have been impacted since 2016 with 2 catastrophic event hits from Hurricanes Matthew and Florence, and now the effects of COVID-19. Her role at the agency includes providing the mental health education and early intervention to allow children, families, and staff to thrive in the face of repeated trauma. Ms. Harrell, thank you for being here and for all the work you do to build resiliency and mental wellness in the communities you serve. Welcome to Listen Up NC.
Thank you, Mr. Boston, for having me.
We are hearing more and more about the impacts of trauma and traumatic events, particularly on children. Can you tell us from a mental health perspective, what is the definition of trauma?
Well, before we begin talking about definitions and numbers and all the things that we discuss in our field, I want to make sure that everybody knows that what we do in mental health is always from what we call a trauma-informed perspective. So I want to honor the fact that those listening on the program today and those participating in the program today, myself included, are all potential trauma survivors. And we have to honor that some of the things that folks might hear today us discuss can initially be unsettling if you've never heard this information. But I want them as listeners to hang on. Don't turn the radio off. Don't get discouraged, because if you listen all the way to the end, you're going to find out some really awesome information to go along with some of the things that we're going to discuss today. So to go back, Mr. Boston, to your original question, which was what is the definition of trauma? The American Psychological Association defines trauma as an emotional response to a terrible event. And most often when we think of trauma, we think of the things you mentioned earlier, like natural disasters, being in an automobile accident, a rape, people who've been involved in war. And those things are certainly traumatic events and fit that mold. But one thing that's important to understand about trauma is that it goes by something called perceived threat. And that means that by definition, the person who has witnessed or been a part of the event gets to define whether it was traumatic to them or not. I can have the same individuals. We can use examples like the Boston Marathon bombing or potentially some of the mass shootings that we've seen in our schools over the years. You know, you can have 2 survivors that walk out of those situations and have 2 very different psychological outcomes. So, those are important. What we really want to focus on today about trauma, though, is something called adverse childhood experiences. And that's what my focus is here, primarily in my role. And listeners may hear it referred to as ACEs, which is the short term for that. And those are actually defined as traumatic events that happen to children under the age of 18. We're familiar with a lot of these things, such as physical abuse, sexual abuse, emotional abuse, neglect. But some of the ones that people don't think about often are things like caregiver substance abuse, caregiver with mental illness. Also, one that people don't think about a lot because it's so commonplace in our society, divorce. And actually, one of the top adverse childhood experiences in the state of North Carolina is poverty. And those of us who work in our communities and community action agencies know just how dire the poverty situation is in many of our communities in North Carolina. And now that we're in COVID, we're just really concerned about what that means moving forward. So a child who lives daily under this, we call it toxic stress, and their little bodies are just constantly trying to regulate and adjust to all of these stressors. And so that's kind of your definition of broadband of trauma, and then an introduction into adverse childhood experiences.
Oh, thank you so much for that. The information is helpful in terms of just helping us understand the breadth of trauma. So thank you for sharing that. What are some impacts of that traumatic events have on mental health?
As far as on mental health, first of all, if someone witnesses a traumatic event or they're involved in an individual traumatic event, usually the first thing that happens, they go into something called acute stress disorder. They're going to have emotional mood swings, they're going to be tearful, they're going to have flashbacks possibly, and some physical complaints. If that is not mitigated, intervened, and treated, that can often develop into what we hear a lot about in our society now, which is PTSD, which stands for post-traumatic stress disorder. And PTSD is a chronic anxiety disorder, which can be learned to navigate and live with, but it is something that folks will live with for their life. In particular, though, with children, we tend to see more behavioral outcomes. Those of us who work in educational systems and with children, we have a saying, behavior carries a message. And so if we see behavior out of children, we're learning to not say, why do they do that? We're learning to say, what happened to you? Which is a very different phrase when we think about working with children and what's going on with them. Also with young children, we often see regressive behaviors. They can go back to maybe they were completely potty trained and now they're having accidents, or maybe they had stopped sucking their thumb and now they reverted back to some of those behaviors. So really, from a mental health standpoint, really I say anything that looks unusual for your child for several weeks that you've not seen.
Thank you. I appreciate the framing of that to help us understand how that looks. So another thing that we don't often hear about is traumatic events impacting physical health. Can you share some of the effects of traumatic events on physical health with our listeners?
I can, and I'll tell you that's exactly why I'm still in the mental health field. I've been in the profession for over 20 years, and about 4 years ago, I returned back to do a second master's in public health, and my goal was to get out of mental health work because I was burned out. But once I got into the work and started to see you can't work with physical health without looking at the impacts of mental health. And so what I'm going to share with the listeners today is what I just became very excited about. Initially, like I said, when you first hear this information, you say, how can you get excited about that? That sounds depressing. But when you realize that you can stop this trajectory if you just intervene at the beginning instead of trying to pour water on a raging fire at the end, it gets really exciting. So if everybody will just hold on, we'll get to that exciting part. So what we've learned is that toxic stress over time, it's a wear and tear on the body system. So all of us listeners are probably familiar with 8th grade science class when you learned about fight or flight, and you learned that the body is wired to do one thing and one thing only. We are wired to survive. So when we have a threat, whether it's an immediate physical threat in front of us or whether it's a psychological threat of some sort, we have that biological response that puts us into fight or flight. We're ready to either fight for our lives or run for our lives. Well, that was great when that was a caveman day and you had to run from the saber-toothed tiger. But in this day and time, most of our stressors are invisible bears and tigers. They're those psychological things. And if I'm a young child and that bear comes home every night, or this happens over here and I can't control it, that wears on our body systems and begins to actually break down our DNA, which is really scary when you think about from a child's developmental standpoint, that is quickly replicating and changing every day. So a groundbreaking study was done in 1998, which sadly then lay buried for many, many years, that really showed the connection between adverse childhood experiences. The more adverse childhood experiences that you have, the higher the correlation to obesity, diabetes, cardiovascular disease, and of course, many of our substance use disorders. I think for me, one of the strongest things I saw that really was like, wow, we have to do something about this. Kids who grow up and have an adverse childhood score of 4 or higher have a 10 times more high likelihood of being an intravenous drug user. And I think about the opioid crisis, and I think about just how many lives have been lost and the dire situation we're in as a state. And I think about how we have this opportunity with little people and their parents right now in our systems to stop that in the future. And that just gets me pretty excited. So there are a lot of physical connections, not just mental connections to trauma.
Okay, that's fascinating. Thanks for sharing that. So you mentioned the long-term effects on individuals, and you also discussed a little bit about the community, but can you speak more about the long-term community impacts of childhood trauma?
I can all day, but sadly we have a small amount of time, but I'll try to condense myself. There's some of you who participate on social media have probably seen a meme that gets shared around quite frequently, and it actually says trauma is the new gateway drug, and that is 100% accurate. Trauma is such a problem in our communities because think about it, if we have these folks who have all of this dysregulated nervous system and they're not able to cope with situations, that also increases our risk for violence in the community. It also increases our risk for folks to develop disability and not be able to work, and that's their self-esteem, that's their livelihood, and it also puts them now in financial distress. It's a huge financial burden for our communities because if we have folks who are not able to work, then they're also in need of greater assistance because of physical needs or mental health needs, emotional needs. And sadly, what happens is we perpetuate what we call that generational trauma that just goes from one generation to the next generation, and really puts our communities in a sad state. You know, it's a tossed around term a lot, but it's really true. Broken people break other people. And so that's what's so exciting to me to be in the Headstart, early Headstart area, is if we can support these families and these children when they're young, then we're just really watering from the roots up. I feel like as a society, if you think about the image of a flower, we try to fix things with the petals of the flower, but the problem is at the root. And if we don't start addressing at the root, we're never going to have the full capacity that every human being has and can possess to be.
That's a great analogy. So in addition to trauma, we also hear about protective factors. What are those and how do they work?
Okay, now here's where everybody needs to turn up their radio because now we're to the exciting part, okay? So yes, all of those things that I've shared earlier, they are true. They are very well researched and founded. But the wonderful news is that if children have protective factors in place, sadly, I wish we had a magic wand and we could prevent every child from ever experiencing something traumatic, but we're probably not going to be able to do that. But what we can do as a community is we can increase every protective factor that we can. So what am I talking about here? What I mean are things that if they are in place, they actually buffer and support that child through difficult processes. And obviously that's going to start with close relationships with adults. Particularly, we want to encourage and foster those parenting relationships. And one of the things we do here in our program is we're really heavy on parenting programs, and we're here to empower our parents. I think a lot of parenting programs in the past have been, the way they've been marketed or targeted, didn't mean to, but they made parents feel like they were incompetent and they didn't know what to do. And that's not true. I have 3 children. They did not come with a manual. And so we all need support as parents. So also, some of that is parental resilience. If I have parents who've been through a lot of challenges in their lives, we need to make sure that they go somewhere and work through those if they need mental health support. We also want to help our children identify their sense of purpose. And a lot of times that comes with our faith communities supporting us in the community. People that are coaches and things, all of these folks are protective factors. And also one of the biggest things that we can do, and it is one of the things that I love about Headstart and early Headstart that I'm learning as I'm coming into this world, we've been doing this for years and everybody else needs to take notes. Social emotional curriculum has got to be robust and has got to be a strong part of raising up children. As a society in general, we've become so enamored with academics, and there's nothing wrong with academics. But if we do not know how to have coping skills, how to socially interact appropriately, these cause a lot of issues. And those coping skills can help kids be such a great protective factor. So if these systems are in place, they really help children navigate through. If we want to go back and use the flower example, they're a bit like some supports to help it as it's growing up through.
Very good. So those are some really good tips too, in terms of what we can do as grown people to, or adults to help children. Are there any other things that adults can help children in regard to childhood trauma?
Yes, there are lots of things. I think number one, in anything that we want to do to bring about change, no matter what that change is in a society, we have to have awareness. Awareness is your first step. And so I would encourage anyone who's listening, any adult who's listening to this program, you have access to children, whether they're your own children, they're your grandchildren, maybe you work in the field and you have access to children. You might be a member of a faith community or you volunteer with an organization. The future of children are very important. I like to think one day I'm going to be in a rest home one day and these children are going to be taking care of me. And I'd like to know that they are functioning as good adults, right? But I think we all have value and these children are important to us. So I would recommend to listeners that they listen to a TED Talk by Dr. Nadine Burke-Harris. They can just Google TED Talk, Dr. Nadine Burke-Harris. She is my superhero. She has done some very groundbreaking work on adverse childhood experiences. She also has a very readable book called The Deepest Well. Again, that's Dr. Nadine Burke-Harris, and the book is The Deepest Well. It really reads like a novel, even though she is so super smart scientifically. But if folks will get a lot of good suggestions out of there. But my slogan is prevent, mitigate, and treat. So as anything that you can do, if you are a person like a coach or a member of something and you see things that look not right, we're not in that society anymore where we say, well, that's not my business. It absolutely is our business to look out for children.
Thanks for that. And so you began by talking about awareness. And what should our listeners do if they suspect that a child they know or that they themselves need help healing from traumatic events?
Well, I think this goes for our children and our adults that are listening, because often what happens when I do these presentations throughout the communities and the state, folks come up after and they say, this happened to me as a child and I've never thought it was important, or I didn't know that it could be a root of this. So I'm going to talk about what to do with children first. If you're a parent or a caregiver or someone who needs to access services for a child, always I recommend to begin with your pediatrician or your healthcare provider, because they're going to want to do a thorough physical and just get a really good background of what's going on. And then they are the ones who can share their recommendations for mental health providers in the community and see where you need to be connected for resources. That's where I would start. One thing I do want to make a real strong push for folks, if you suspect your child, another child, or a child comes to you and they are talking about sexual abuse potentially, please do not question children about what happened, who did what. You need to intervene with a professional very quickly, because those types of questions should only be asked by someone who is forensically trained to ask those types of questions of children. It gets into some very hairy areas and you can actually make the situation worse. So don't not do it, but just don't ask a lot of detailed questions. Just access appropriate help for a child. And again, I would contact their pediatrician immediately for that type of assistance. If you're an adult listening and you're like, wow, this really kind of awakened something in me or shook something up that I didn't know was there or hadn't thought about in years, again, I would encourage you to start with your family physician to access some services or go in and talk with them about, your concerns. And then if you work for a company, a lot of companies have what's called an employee assistance program, and you might see that in your handbook labeled EAP program. And often what that means is you get 3 to 5 sessions to work with a mental health professional that's covered by your company. So I would always check to see if you have that benefit, because that's really nice. But also, if you do need to get in with a professional and you do have a history of some type of trauma, I would encourage you to interview your mental health professional to make sure that they have training in working with trauma. Not all mental health professionals are equipped to work with all levels of trauma. So it's very important that you find not only a professional, but the professional that meets your needs.
Well, thank you so much. This information has been very, very valuable. And thank you for your leadership and service. We appreciate all of the work you continue to do. Listeners, for more information, visit the Wayne Action Group for Economic Solvency, Inc., Wages. Their website is www.wagesnc.org. That would be wagesnc.org to learn more information. So our time is up. So radio friends, meet us here next Saturday. To find your local community action agency or Headstart program, visit www.nccaa.net or www.headstartnc.org. Until next week, be safe and listen up, NC.